Okay, so that's the EQ bit of the process. And I want to talk about some kind of other bits, acoustic aspects, psychoacoustic aspects of mixing. And this is what we're talking to Steve a little bit about. Acoustic space. This is how I work. I like to try and think of an acoustic space that the performance is taking place in. So is this a performance that's on a stage? Is it a performance that's in somebody's living room? Is it a performance that sounds like it's in a studio? Is it a performance that wants to sound like it's in a cave or a valley or whatever? And then think about that acoustic space in terms of the frequency response of that space, the distance from that source, which alters the kind of attack of that space, and the panning as well. All those things kind of change. So I'll go through these a bit at a time. I'll talk about acoustic space and then kind of frequency space, compression and loudness, which is the thing that Kit mentioned a moment ago, and key compression, and then something called active mixing, which is a bit of a clue as to how to work your way around some of these things. Acoustic space. I tend to believe dry sounds are less attractive, but it's not always the case. I have heard some recordings. I downloaded a jazz recording recently where, as far as I can tell, the vocal is absolutely dry and it sounds wonderful. But she is performing a kind of music which actually would sound great like that. It sounds as if somebody's sitting on your own sofa singing to you. But if you've ever been in an anechoic chamber, you know, these areas where virtually all sound is absorbed, it's actually very uncomfortable. There was one in the psychology department where I did my undergrad training, and a mate of mine took a mandolin in to play in an anechoic chamber, and it sounded horrible. There's no sustain, there's no life to it. It sounds as if the string's been on it for 20 years. It just sounds awful. They absorb all sound, and it kind of sounds oppressive. When you take away all the sound around you, there's almost a feeling like the air pressure's gone up and you've been squeezed. So it's not a nice sound. My experience has been that DI signals from almost any source, whether it's a synth, whether it's a DI bass, whether it's a DI acoustic guitar, are actually really difficult to sit in a mix unless you do something to them. Because they tend not to have, obviously DIs from acoustic instruments will have a bit of resonance from the body of the instrument, but there's not much going on that tells you what kind of space this instrument was recorded in. We also use reflections as one of the ways to locate sounds. It's something that our ears are doing all the time. Human ears are very, very good, because they were a key to our survival, to picking up high frequency kind of peripheral sounds, locating them, and particularly, again, sounds in that kind of 1 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz region. We're not very good at locating very, very low frequencies, which is why lots of PAs can get away with a single subwoofer, because we can't spot those frequencies quite so well. Usually because that's an earthquake and it's coming from everywhere anyway. Whereas the twig snapping behind you is the tiger that's about to leap on you, and you've got to get it away that quickly. So we use reflections as a way of placing sounds, and by the same token as a way of separating sounds. We're hearing that one sound's coming from one place and another one's coming from somewhere else. Multi-track recording techniques, certainly, but I think less so now, but certainly during the kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, when we had little drum booths and lots of these kind of things to separate musicians in a room, tried to minimise ambience and maximise the separation between instruments in a mix. It was the kind of side effect of multi-track recording. We tried to keep them as separate as possible, so that when it comes to the mix, we've got absolute control over them, and we can compress one sound without affecting another. A lot of recordings I've heard nowadays actually seem to be scrapping that entirely and going back to the idea of capturing the sound of the room, distant drum miking in particular, certainly during the 80s and 90s when I was listening to music. Well, not so much during the 90s because it was crap then, 70s and 80s. It was a tiny drum booth, certainly smaller than these, with the mics almost kind of on the skin. The room was as dead as possible, and you put the reverb on afterwards. So the source was absolutely dead. Nowadays they're looking for nice sounding drum rooms and you mic from 6 feet away and emphasise the sound. So some multi-track recording techniques try to take the ambience out of the sound and leave it with just the kind of source. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, home recording, if you haven't got suitable acoustic spaces or you're overdubbing, you might not have the luxury of being able to add the sound of a nice room, because you might not have a room that's big enough not to have any nasty resonances, or the kind of, this is a big room and it's got sound, it's got reflections, but they're fairly evenly distributed. It's not a kind of boxy sound. So, acoustic space, a lot of recordings we've got, and particularly because a couple of people have mentioned using virtual instruments as well. Virtual instruments are often either dry or they've got their own acoustic space added, but it may not be the same acoustic space as the other instruments. You know, you may have something that's been added to the sound because it sounds nice, but it may not be the same acoustic space that your vocalist is in. I'm going to try another little experiment. Nothing to do with Satan this time, thank goodness. I'm going to play 4 tracks of the same singer. Actually 4 takes of the same singer singing the same line with different acoustic processes on it. What I'd like to do is just have a little, in fact play all 4 of them one after the other, and if you just have a think of what kind of space is this singer in? What does the sound, what clues does the sound give you about where the recording was taking place and the environment that it was in? Let's try the first one.
You mess with my hand, blind my eyes, make me see red. Watch TV, smoke cigarettes, flick the ash in my bed. I should be on my own, all my friends said they'd know. You're hard to keep, you don't come cheap, talk all day on my phone. But you know that when I see those eyes so blue.
Okay, second one.
You mess with my hand, blind my eyes, make me see red. Watch TV, smoke cigarettes, flick the ash in my bed. I should be on my own, all my friends said they'd know. You mess with my hand, blind my eyes, make me see red. Watch TV, smoke cigarettes, flick the ash in my bed. I should be on my own, all my friends said they'd know. You're hard to. You mess with my hand, blind my eyes, make me see red. Watch TV, smoke cigarettes, flick the ash in my bed. I should be on my own, all my friends said they'd know. You're hard to keep, you don't come cheap, talk all day on my phone.
Okay. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to what the acoustic was that was kind of the space that was surrounding those vocals? Let's start with the first one.
Booth.
Yeah?
Vocal booth.
And what can you hear that makes you think that's what it is?
You can tell she's close mic'd,
Yeah.
and I'm not really hearing any kind of space around it.
Right. Yeah.
Well, apart from the one we're in now.
Yeah. So it's absorbent. There's no kind of obvious reflections or bounces from that at all. Yeah. And what does it sound like? It's clear, but it's kind of, to me, it sounds kind of isolated. It's a bit kind of right up front and a bit flat. Yeah. Okay. What about the second one?
They all sound to me just like somebody's added a bit of reverb. Like none of them sound realistic at all because it's such a small. Even the last one was still only a small amount.
Yeah.
Compared to if she was actually in a hall, and it would be like the same sound, but the reverb bit would be louder.
Right.
So they all just sound like the studio to me. I guess it didn't really help that you could hear like the mic going, like the distortion from the B's and stuff.
I think this recording was compressed on the way in, so some of those things have been pulled up a little bit. But you said it sounds like the reverb's been added.
Yeah.
Yeah. What gives you that clue? What makes it sound like the reverb's been added?
I think it's because I spent so long playing with different reverbs on Logic, and like it just sounds like when I do that, like it doesn't sound like, none of them sound like she's in a real room. None of them. Yeah. Even though you can hear the reverb slightly more with each one. Well, that's what I heard anyway. Yeah. It just, it just sounds really like added, not real.
Yeah. And that's exactly what it is, because it's the same take with a process added to it, which kind of gives it a little bit of life. But I haven't done anything with the take itself. It's left as it is, and that's a very important point. One that we'll come back to in a minute. Any kind of clues about the second one, about what the processing was on the second one?
It sounds like a It's funny, I couldn't identify a type of space, but it sounded
Yeah.
a bit sad and bleak
Yeah.
somehow, like some kind of empty industrial space, kind of concretey.
Quite hard surfaces,
Right.
like, you know, like kind of bathroom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought concrete, but yeah,
Yeah.
hard.
So you start to make kind of guesses. In fact, the second one is just 2 straight repeats with no EQ. It's 190 milliseconds on one side and 120 milliseconds.
Hmm.
210 seconds on the other side. So it's just 2 very, very fast repeats. So close to the original sound that it's hard to hear them as echoes. It's not even really slapback echo.
Yeah.
But straight away you can start to hear what sounds like the sound bouncing off a hard surface nearby. So you begin to hear a space, but it doesn't have a real kind of identity to it. But it sounds hard because obviously those reflections have got the same bandwidth, same frequency range as the original sound. The third one.
It sounded like some kind of club to me, like
Uh,
a jazz club or something.
yeah. Any other clues apart from, as Pip's already kind of said, it sounds like it's bolted onto the sound. Yeah. The third one is an ambient setting from a lexicon reverb, which is basically just the earlier reflections. So it's like number 2, but with lots and lots of kind of repeats, which gives you those initial reflections that come off that space and kind of tell you what's immediately around it. And the fourth one.
It'd be something hall, I think, but only turned up a little bit.
Yeah.
So it'd be some kind of hall, maybe.
Right. Anybody else? Yeah. Right. Yeah. The last one, number 4, is actually number 3 with pre-delay. So there's a pause between, so you get the sound, there's a pre-delay, I think of about 40 milliseconds, which you're actually hearing as a bigger space. But it's the same reflections, but they're not coming straight after the voice, they're coming slightly behind it. Now, the normal setting in which we hear a sound like that is actually if the person is standing very close to us and the reflections are coming, the sound's going down into a reflective area and coming back again. So
Yeah.
the early reflections don't come straight after the voice. So it would be almost like somebody standing very close to you in a big hall, and you get the clean sound first and then that delay afterwards, where if they're standing away from you in a big hall, the reflections arrive much closer to the straight sound. Yeah. But it is, again, it's a kind of synthetic process, and I've done nothing to the voice itself.
Can I just add something to that last
Yeah.
one? I think it sounded a bit like somebody was, like, there's a hall, and then there's a small doorway, and then there's a small room through the doorway attached to the hall, and you're in the small room,
Yeah.
and you hear the echo come from, like, the bit of, you're both you and the singer in the small room, and the singer's singing, like, away from the door, but a little bit of the sound managed to get through into the hall, and then you hear the echo of that
Comes
sound
back
because it's so
again, yeah.
soft.
Yeah.
It sounded more like that than being in a hall.
What
if
a
that
vivid
makes sense.
imagination. Well, that would be exactly the kind of situation that would give you a pre-delay, that reverb, in that the sound leaks out of a relatively absorbent area into a live area
Yeah.
and then comes back in again. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the technique I think that Zeppelin and so on often use with sticking mics out in the hallway to get the sound of the hallway behind. Although I think in some cases bottom strings were actually put out in the hallway and recorded in that way.
Mm.
But as you pointed out, they all kind of sound as if they're added. They're not really part of the sound itself. Anybody got any clues as to why that might be?
The top end hasn't changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember I played the kind of sub 400 hertz bit, and it sounds as if that's a long way off. Yeah. But there's no reverb added to that. That just sounded like it was a loud sound coming from next door. It's not because there's reverb added. It's because the top's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I didn't roll the top off that vocal in any of those clips. So what you hear is a vocal that's there, and then there's some reverb that's a bit there, and then there's a bit more that's there, and there's a bit more that's there. But the voice is still here because of the top end. And if I give you a kind of quick example, air is actually not a great conductor of sound. It's nowhere near as good as solids. You can fire sound through a metal bar much faster and much more accurately than you can through air, because air absorbs it and it diffuses. The inverse square law applies to air just like it does most of the light and most of the kind of forms of radiation, in that if you double the distance from the source of the sound, the intensity of the sound drops to a quarter, not half, because it's kind of like the sound's diffusing in all directions. This is assuming that there are no kind of reflections or resonances and so on that might be adding to it. In an anechoic chamber, if you double the distance from the source, the sound doesn't drop by a half, it drops to a quarter of the original sound, and then a quarter again for each subsequent doubling. So, as sound diffuses through there, it loses top end. So if you want to make a sound further away, you can't just add reverb to it. You actually have to simulate its movement through air as well. And one of the things that does is the sound diffuses, the top end goes, and transients change as well. As in the kind of attack portion of the sound, it gets diffused, it gets kind of spread out. And right in front of a piano, when somebody runs down the keyboard, you can hear the notes move across your kind of field. And that's how we understand that kind of sound. If you stand in front of a group of people and they talk to you, you hear voices coming from different places. If you're standing 30 feet back from them, most of them sound like they're in the middle. So one of the other effects of if we push something back into a mix is we're kind of losing transients, we're losing top end, and we're also losing location. Now you can still pan things which are off at a distance, but you can't pan the left hand and the right hand of a piano really wide if you want it to sound like it's 20 feet away from you. Because it will sound like you've got your head in the piano and it's 20 feet away. Yeah? Which is back to our optical illusion that we had at the beginning. Part of our brain will be saying, that's a great piano, it's right in front of us. Why does it ring like that? Why has it got no top end? Or why has it got loads of top end and loads of reverb? Now, and I think this is one of the things that when we go back to what I was talking about as natural recording, when natural recordings were mixed by having the drummer 10 feet away at the back of the room and everybody playing into one mic at the front, that was all taken care of by the air in the room. The air did the mixing. It took the top end off, it diffused the transients, it spread things out. So we need to be mixing like we're full of air, I suppose. We need to have air in our heads. No, that's not a good analogy. But we need to be thinking about what would this sound like if it was coming through air, and how would that change it? And particularly given that we might be using virtual instruments which are produced to sound great in the shop, so you'll buy them. And they may have their own kind of acoustic space attached to them as well. And then I suppose the other bit is then thinking about those early reflections, giving you a clue as to how big this room is. And as Kit and Steve were saying, that early reflections, that 120 milliseconds and 190 and 210 milliseconds sounds like a bathroom. So if you're going to put your singer in a bathroom, you can't then put the drums in a hall and expect it to sound as if they were kind of in the same place. Yeah? Because your brain will say, they don't all sound like they're together. They're not. I can't hear this as a kind of performance because they're all in different places at the same time. And I sound like I've got my head inside the bass drum because the high tom's coming from over there and the floor tom's coming from over there. So, this is a technique I'm still learning. Kind of makes sense of, but I tend to use. I still mix on a mixing desk, although I do mix in the box occasionally if I think I might need to repeat it, or I'm probably going to get it wrong and have to do it again and somebody wants it quickly. But the same applies whether you're mixing on a mixing desk or in the box. I tend to use 3 send reverb effects across a mix, and I use them as sends, not as inserts, so that if I change them, they change for everything, not just for. So I think one of the choices with kind of software mixing is you can put a reverb as an insert on every single channel, and then if you kind of think, I need a bit longer reverb on the vocal and turn that up, but the reverb on the drum stays the same, you're starting to push them into different spaces straight away. So by using reverb effects across the entire mix, your computer doesn't have to work as hard as well if you do that. I tend to use outboard reverb, but kind of principle is the same. And those 3 effects are actually similar to the ones that we're looking at on those clips. I tend to use a couple of very, very short repeats, which kind of, for something which is right up front, where actually you're just getting the initial bounce off the walls. And that might be something like Yamaha that's got a centre repeat and a left and a right repeat, and they're very, very low in the mix. They're just there to kind of give the clue as to how far it is to the nearest wall. And then second after that, I might use an ambience sound, something like the Mexican or a plate. Plate reverbs were kind of what follow on from spring reverbs, and they tend to have a lot of early reflections but not a lot of length. or a room simulator if you've got the kind of technology, Quantec Mix, and I'm sure that's available in software as well. And then after that, maybe something that actually sounds like the full-length reverb, if you like, lots and lots of reflections and diffusion. And I set them up on 3 separate sends, and then use them in different proportions, depending on whether the sound is supposed to be at the front of this room, in which case most of it is going to be the repeats, or at the back of this room, in which case there'll be fewer early repeats and more of the kind of diffuse reverb. And I try and avoid using reverbs as inserts, and if I'm using virtual instruments, I use BFD, the drum program, quite a lot. I take off the room mics in BFD, so I've just got the straight sound coming into the desk, and then drop that into the same space that everything else is in. And then use that in combination with EQ. So again, kind of thinking if I'm going to push something further back in the mix, I need to simulate the effect of it coming through more air, and that air will be rolling off the very top and the very bottom of the sound. And with panning as well, not to make instruments sound very, very wide if they're a long way away. One of the nice techniques with depth is maybe have a drum kit which is almost in mono, right at the back of the mix, and then maybe add a cabassa or a hi-hat or a shaker or something like that right out on the left or the right, very, very dry. So you've kind of got, a bit like kind of photographers do when they use shallow depth of field, you get something that's right up front and very much in focus, and then you get the kind of, they call it bokeh, I think, the photographers. You've got something in the back which is kind of big and prominent, but not quite in focus, but still pushing things along. So you get that visual, that equivalent of the visual depth.